Good evening and thank you. I don't quite know how to respond to that. I'm afraid if I say anything, it'll detract from what you said. I'd be demeaning myself after what you said. But I thank you, Mr. Johnson, and I've heard many positive things about Marshall College and the fact that it experienced difficulties during the contest, as did Washington College, where I'm now serve as president. I'd like to thank each of you for taking time from your busy schedules to be here. As Mr. Johnson has done, I've assumed the role of president of Washington College, and in that capacity, I'm charged with overseeing the instruction of our youth with the truths of the past so that they'll be able to make proper and educated decisions in the future. In order to achieve this goal, I feel it necessary to make people aware of some of the fallacies that the people have been burdened with over the last couple of years since the war is over. And I'd like to discuss some of these fallacies this evening, if you will, and if you'll just indulge with me for the next few minutes while I'll discuss some of these issues. And you'll see that I'm referring to some notes throughout my remarks this evening. And that's because in many cases I'm going to be quoting people. I want to make certain that what I say is right, and so for that reason I'll refer to these notes. From its beginning, Mr. Lincoln and those people referred to the contest as a civil war. Let me just kind of set the stage here if I can. In 1873, King George granted the former colonies their independence under the Treaty of Paris. In the document, he stated, and I'm quoting the Treaty of Paris, "I hereby declare them to be free and independent sovereign states." Them meaning the former colonies, which are now free and independent sovereign states. States, by definition, nations and countries are all the same, with the exception that there's a little more added to the word state, and that is that a state is a governmental body that controls a nation or a country. In 1787, 4 years later, our founding fathers proffered the first version of the Constitution of the United States of America. And in 1789, it was adopted, it was ratified by 9 of the free and independent sovereign nations. Each of these sovereign bodies had to establish its own republican form of government before they could even apply for membership into the Union of Nations. It was a requirement. By so doing, a Union of Nations on the North American continent was formed. Not one nation, as Mr. Lincoln led the American people to believe, but a union of nations or countries. If Mr. Lincoln was aware of this, he certainly did all he could to cast aside the realities and insert his own, and I quote, unwritten constitution, unquote. This is a phrase that he used on several occasions, and particularly in February of 1860 during a speech to a large gathering. So then, what is a civil war? By definition, a civil war exists when two parties within the same state, nation, or country are vying for supremacy. Our founding fathers established a union of nations, not one nation. And the very minute that it's referred to as a civil war, the individual sovereignty, the independence, the very statehood itself is conceded. By referring to the contest as a civil war, the rights of the independent states are cast aside and all sovereigns are lumped into one single government, which was not the case because each of the sovereigns had to have their own established republican form of government. Mr. Lincoln's concept was in total contrast to the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. So then, what was the underlying reason why so many of the Southern leaders and young men were willing to separate themselves and go off to defend its territories from the invaders? What was the reason? To preserve the Constitution. All that the South has ever desired was that the Union, as established by our forefathers, should be preserved and that the government, as originally organized, should be administered in purity and truth. So that brings us to the issue of treason. Were those who left the Union and aligned themselves with the Confederacy, were they treasonous? To this, I would refer you to the teachings by the United States government at the United States Military Academy, commonly referred to as West Point. I have with me, I started my studies at the United States Military Academy in 1825, and that year, Mr. Rawl published a book entitled A View of the Constitution of the United States of America. Let me read to you a few excerpts from this authorized teaching material. And what I'm saying tonight is all for your consumption, and I would encourage each of you to, on your own, to do the research, and you'll find that what I'm saying is all true. Here's some comments from the teaching material at the Military Academy. It depends on the state itself to retain or abolish the principle of representation because it depends on itself whether it will continue a member of the Union. To deny this right would be inconsistent with the principle on which all our political systems are founded, which is that the people have, in all cases, a right to determine how they will be governed. The states then may wholly withdraw from the Union, but while they continue, they must retain the character of representative republics. The secession of a state from the Union depends on the will of the people of such state. The people of the state may have some reasons to complain in respect to acts of the general government. They may, in such cases, invest some of their own officers with the power of negotiation and may declare an absolute secession in case of their failure. And lastly, the state is the more important entity to which a citizen owes their allegiance, not some union of states. You see, what the United States government was teaching its cadets at the United States Military Academy was that your loyalty is first to your state. And as long as your state is a member of the Union of States, then your loyalty transfers to the Union. But if your state exercises its constitutional right of secession, then you have to return with your state or you become a traitor to the Constitution, the document that you took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend. You be the judge as to whether the men of the South were treasonous or not. And while on the issue of state sovereignty, let's chat about secession and its legality. We'll expound on this a little bit. Referring again to the founders, they were of the opinion that each sovereign had virtually unlimited powers, one of which was to decide whether to enter into the Union of States. And if they had the right to make a decision to enter into the Union of States, then they certainly had the right to determine whether they wanted to withdraw from that Union of States if it came to their detriment. There's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits a state from seceding. It's a God-given right. The very subject received considerable attention during the ratification period. And James Madison, who is commonly referred to as the father of the Constitution, addressed it in Federalist Paper number 45. But then Mr. Lincoln believed the Constitution to be a flawed document and spoke of it in unflattering terms on numerous occasions. On February 27, 1860, while addressing a large group at the Cooper Institute in New York City, he went so far as to state the document was filled with flaws, the decisions of the Supreme Court were in error, and his, here's the term again, unwritten Constitution was to be considered when dealing with affairs of the state. Mr. Lincoln intended to, quote, establish a standard of government other than the constitutional union of the American states. With secession as their only recourse, the southern states felt compelled to withdraw from a union that was about to cast aside the rule of law and act as if it were a monarchy. Was secession a topic of discussion prior to the war between the states? Yes, on numerous occasions. 1803 to 1805 during the Jefferson administration, 1812 to 1815 during the Madison administration, 1830 to 32 under the Jackson administration, and again in 1846 under the Polk administration. On each occasion, the sitting president at the time acknowledged the fact that the states had the right to secede if they so desired. And it should be noted that all presidents prior to Mr. Lincoln acknowledged that. Mr. Lincoln acknowledged this in a speech he gave in 1848 when he stated, and I quote, "This country with its institutions belongs to the people who inhabit it. Whenever they shall grow weary of the existing government, they can exercise their constitutional rights of amending it or exercise their revolutionary right to overthrow it." Unquote. Now, probably one of the greatest misconceptions is that the war between the states was fought over slavery. Those who subscribe to this belief see Mr. Lincoln as the benevolent leader who made unimaginable sacrifices in human blood to wipe out America's greatest sin. And while the human sacrifice is indisputable and the sin was monumental, the war's purpose was not to free the blacks from the shackles of bondage. Rather, the war was commenced with one purpose in mind: to preserve the Union at all costs, and to put it in Mr. Lincoln's terms, no ifs, ands, or buts. It's my way or else. Eliminating slavery was not a priority with Mr. Lincoln. Has anyone ever seen a sign that said, "Join the army, free the slaves"? No. There were lots of signs that said, "Join the army, preserve the Union." As I said, Mr. Lincoln did not go to war to preserve slavery, or to abolish slavery. Hear the words of Mr. Lincoln himself, and I quote, "What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I shall do less whenever I shall believe that what I am doing hurts the cause, and I shall do more whenever I shall believe doing more helps the cause." During a debate with Stephen Douglas on September the 18th, 1858, Mr. Lincoln said, and I'm quoting again, "I will say then that I am not, nor have ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races, that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, While they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. I say upon this occasion, I do not perceive that because the white man is to have the superior position, the Negro should be denied everything. I will add to this that I have never seen, to my knowledge, a man, woman, or child who was in favor of producing a perfect equality, social or political, between Negroes and the white man. On August 22, 1862, 1 month before he signs the Emancipation Proclamation, Mr. Lincoln wrote a letter to Horace Greeley, a prominent newspaper man in New York, and he said, and I quote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Unquote. And on March 4th, 1861, in his first inaugural address, and I'm just going to paraphrase this because it's too long to read it all, he said, "I have no intentions of disrupting slavery in the areas where it exists. Furthermore, I'll support a constitutional amendment guaranteeing the right of one person to own another. And if you catch a runaway slave, make certain that you turn it back to its master." I ask you, does that sound like a man who went to war to abolish slavery? Now, as to the firing the first shot, on February the 15th, 1861, the Confederate Congress passed a resolution declaring its sense, and I quote, "that a commission of 3 be appointed by the President-elect as early as possible and sent to the government of the United States for the purpose of attempting to settle questions of disagreement between the two governments upon principles of right, justice, equity, and good faith." John Forsyth of Alabama, Martin Crawford of Georgia, and A.B. Roman of Louisiana, all statesmen of acknowledged ability, were appointed as commissioners and immediately departed for Washington City. Upon arrival, an audience with Mr. Seward of Mr. Lincoln's cabinet was requested in an effort to resolve a number of issues, not the least of which was Fort Pickens in Florida and Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Mr. Seward did not meet with them, but sent an assurance by Justices Nelson and Campbell of the Supreme Court that there was, and I quote, "no design to reinforce Fort Sumter, and that it would be abandoned within 10 days, unquote. This information was quickly reported to President Davis, and after the 10 days was up and no effort had been made to follow through with what he'd been told, Justice Campbell contacted Mr. Seward again, and Mr. Seward assured him that, and I quote, "the delay was not the result of bad faith, but attributable to causes consistent with the intention to fulfill the engagement," unquote. On April the 7th, the relief squadron left New York Harbor, causing general alarm, to which Justice Campbell inquired of Mr. Seward, and I quote, "if the assurances he had given were well or were they ill-founded?" Seward's reply, and I quote, "faith as to Fort Sumter fully kept, wait and see," unquote. This relief squadron was then on its way to Charleston with instructions to provision and reinforce Fort Sumter, quote, "peacefully if permitted, otherwise by force," unquote. Here was deception. Here was treachery. Here was falsehood. Here was scheming by Seward and Lincoln. The stage was set. The hour designated by Washington authorities in which to force the South to fire on the flag of the North was at hand. It was all necessary that the Northern heart should be fired on, thus uniting the Northern people. And the defenders of Charleston Harbor fell right into the trap. Henry Hallam, in his 1827 works entitled Constitutional History of England, says, and I quote, "The aggressor in a war is not the first who uses force, but the first who renders force necessary." We all know the results of those fateful days of April the 12th, 13th, and 14th, 1861, and the subsequent contest that dissolved and destroyed the South and the homes and the families that lived there. And I've touched on but a few of the fallacies that have been perpetuated over the years, and I believe will continue to be put forth. A majority of those who will make up future generations will do little to learn the truth. What then? A young former Union officer visited me recently at Washington College, and he put it this way. He said, "Generally, in our youth, our hearts were touched with fire. We have seen with our own eyes, above and beyond the golden fields, the snowy heights of honor. And it is for us to bear that report to those who follow." He went on to say, and I continue in his words, quote, this is Mr. Oliver Wendell Holmes speaking again. He said, "Not long ago, I heard a young man ask why people still kept up Memorial Day. And it set me thinking of the answer. Not the answer that you and I should give to each other. Not the expression of those feelings that, so long as you live, will make this day sacred to memories of love and grief and heroic youth. But an answer which should command the assent of those who do not share our memories, and in which we of the North and our brethren of the South could join in perfect accord." And I continue, "So far as this last is concerned, to be sure, there is no trouble. The soldiers who were doing their best to kill one another felt less of personal hostility, I am very certain, than some who were not imperiled by their mutual endeavors. I have heard more than one of those who had been gallant and distinguished officers on the Confederate side say that they had had no such feelings. I know that I and those whom I knew best had not. We believed that it was most desirable that the North should win. We believed in the principle that the Union is indissoluble. We, or many of us at least, also believed that the conflict was inevitable and that slavery had lasted long enough. But we equally believed that those who stood against us held just as sacred conviction that were the opposite of ours, and we respected them as every man with a heart must respect those who give all for their belief. The experience of battle soon taught its lesson, even to those who came into the field more bitterly disposed. You could not stand up day after day in those indecisive contests where overwhelming victory was impossible because neither side would run as they ought when beaten, without getting at least something of the same brotherhood for the enemy that the North Pole of a magnet has for the South, each working in opposite sense to the other, but each unable to get along without the other. As it was then, it is now. The soldiers of the war need no explanations. They can join in commemorating a soldier's death with feelings not different in kind, whether he fell toward them or by their side. Gentlefolk, I grieve for posterity. for American principles and American liberty. Our boasted self-government is fast becoming the jeer and laughing stock of the world. This grand scheme of centralization of power in the hands of one branch of the government to the ruin of all others and the annihilation of the Constitution. My opinions would have no influence on correcting this misunderstanding, which has existed between the North and South, and I fear it is still destined to involve the country in greater calamities. The war being at an end, and the issue having been decided, I believe it to be the duty of everyone to unite in the restoration of the country and the reestablishment of peace and harmony. As for me, I have led the young men of the South in battle. I have seen many of them die in the fields. I shall devote my remaining energies to training young men to do their duty in life. I will give that sum. I suspect that there may be a few questions that somebody might want answers to, and I'll do my best at this time to respond to any questions that you might have regarding my comments. We, as those who have seen the elephant, and those of our families that were at home while we were off in battle, it's your duty, it's your responsibility, as Mr. Holmes said, to pass the word on to the others and pass the truth on to the others that follow us. For as time goes on, I suspect the truth could be distorted and blemishes will be placed on those who struggled for the cause that they believed in. Any questions that I can respond to? Yes, sir.
Was it power or money that was the root of the Civil War?
Well, I think Mr. Lincoln, whether he would acknowledge it or not, I think Mr. Lincoln, in his effort to preserve the Union at all cost, he says, whether it's all slave, no slave, or part slave, I don't care about that. We must preserve the Union. So there's got to be something else. There's got to be some other reason. He didn't go to war for slavery. There's got to be another reason. And I'm not a political person. But my senses tell me, and I'll tell you how this comes about. My father-in-law died in October 1857, and I was out west in Texas. By the time I got back, it was November of 1857, and Mr. Custis, while a man of great means, was not one who prepared for his passing. And the Arlington estate was really pretty messed up. There were several plantations that he owned and some islands off the coast of Virginia and just a number of things, holdings. And so I was given a 2-year leave of absence from the military. And it was during this time that I became a farmer, if you will, a planter. Because until that time, I had spent all my years, my adult years, as an officer in the military. And now I was having to settle the estate of a planter, which means it exposes me to what planters were exposed to. And what I found out was that the central government was beginning to force its way into everyday life, especially in the realm of tariffs. The South sold most of their goods to people on the other side of the Atlantic. And it really wasn't a cash transaction, it was a barter system. We'll send you $1 million worth of cotton, and you send us $1 million worth of metal goods, and we'll call it even. The election of 1860 provided an overwhelming majority for the same party who was now going to serve as the president. And there was a gentleman who was instrumental in the tax of 1857 by the name of Morrell from Vermont. And he said, okay, now we're going to revisit the tariff of 57, and we're going to impose the taxes that we really wanted to at that time, now that we have an overwhelming majority in the House and the Senate, and our president is. That particular piece of legislation called for a tariff of 48% on all metal goods imported. And so now you've got the people in the South, especially South Carolina, they're saying, when this man gets in office on March the 4th, they're going to have this legislation already passed, and he's going to sign it, and we're going to have to pay 48% on everything we import, all the farming equipment that we import. And that was, I guess you could say that was the straw that broke the back. As of December 31st, 1860, even before that tariff kicked in, 80% of all the revenue coming into the federal treasury was coming from the southern states. Now, Mr. Lincoln, and don't get me wrong, I suspect that Mr. Lincoln did agonize over the issue of slavery. I don't think you could hold the position of president and have that issue present without it bearing on you. But it took second seat to the money. The signs say, join the army, preserve the Union. Didn't say join the army, free the slaves. Preserve the Union, why? Because 8 out of every $10 comes from the states that are leaving. 800 out of every 1,000. So one of Mr. Lincoln's cabinet members asked him one time, just about the time that he was inaugurated on March the 4th, one of his cabinet members said, Mr. Lincoln, why don't you just let the South go? Just let them go. And Mr. Lincoln's response was, and I'm quoting, let the South go? Let the South go? My God, man, who would pay our tariffs? So, does that answer your question? Questions? Yes, in the back, and then you'll come next.
Generally, as you were saying, if in fact, President Lincoln, if you were indifferent and nonchalant about the slave issue at the beginning, it dramatically changed in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation. But inevitably, it became a matter of economics. Did the South not want to maintain that slave labor cause in their Constitution because it was their livelihood? Did the North not set up a blockade to prevent the shipment of cotton to England, who was their biggest buyer, of course?
Yeah.
Okay, so you had the agrarian society in the South, and then you had the industrial in the North.
Right.
So at the end of the day, it becomes an economic issue, obviously. And then, was not England going to come in and join with the Confederacy if the Confederacy could prove that they could win a battle in the North, thus Harrisburg, Pennsylvania was the initial objective, and then the Gettysburg thing.
Well, I mentioned a minute ago that I'm not politically involved. I don't know all the politics. I've spent enough time with President Davis in the White House during the contest, and slavery was an issue, and a very at the value, according to the president and all this, the figures that he kept, the value of all the slaves in these United States at the time the war broke out was $4.8 billion. That's with a B, $4.8 billion. The value of all the slaves put together was greater than all the other industry in the United States at the time. Now, how did this work? Most of the cotton, tobacco, and rice and stuff that was produced in the South was shipped directly to Europe. But the North was an industrialized society, and so they were counting on some of the cotton to run through their mills. So prior to the war, some of these goods would be sent into the northern harbors and picked up by the industrialists up there and produced and made into clothing or whatever. We'll say clothing. And molasses was made, and all sorts of products was made, and then they were shipped across the pond to Europe. And then from there, the ships went down and dropped anchor off the west coast of Africa and loaded up with slaves and brought them back. And most of the slaves, 50-some% of the slaves came into New York Harbor, and then they were put onto smaller vessels and taken down south where they were purified, is what the term they used. They had to make certain that they weren't carrying diseases and so on that would bring diseases to the rest of the slaves that were already there. But they would be sent down south and put on a block down south, and they would be sold down in the south. The people that were making money, the slaves in the south were used for labor, and the people in the north were making money off that slave labor because they owned the vessels. The vessels were made up north, and so they were just as happy to see the slave trade continue as the South was. But at the same time, the reason that it was done this way is because Virginia and North Carolina and Georgia, all three of those states had already passed laws within their legislative bodies that no slaves could be imported directly from another country into their particular states. They could go from one state to another, but they couldn't come from Africa directly into Virginia. They couldn't come from Africa directly into North Carolina or directly into Georgia, because they'd already said, we're not having this. This was not going to happen here. Slavery was an institution that obviously the South was built on, and at the time the war broke out, slavery was still obviously extremely important to the agricultural society of the South. But they also recognized that it was a very costly institution, slavery was. It's a cradle-to-grave institution. When you buy a slave, he's yours, unless you sell him. And if you don't sell him, let me see if I can give you a good example. And this is what the South was finding out, and they were seeking some way to transition from slavery into a more industrialized agricultural nation, if you will, okay? If somebody went out and bought 20 slaves, 20 18-year-old men, and paid, the average was about $1,800 for a slave at the time, a good, strong male. Within probably 20 years, that male working in the field is going to be worn out. Nobody's going to buy him, so you can't sell him. So he's yours. But he can't work. He's not productive. But he's still yours. So you've got to maintain that person. You've got to feed him, you've got to house him, you've got to give him clothing, you've got to take care of medical expenses if he has them, okay? Even though he's not producing. So what do you have to do now? You have to go buy 20 more to replace them. Now you own 40 and only 50% of them are productive. And the people of the South are beginning to say, we can't go on like this. This is... It's too costly. We've got to find another way. So that's why they were beginning to import metal goods. But under the mercantile exchange system that they had, It was $1 million worth of cotton and $1 million worth of plowshares. No taxes. I mean, there were some taxes. The taxes at that time under the tariff of 57 were minimal compared to what Justin Morrell wanted to raise them to. And that's why so much money was coming in. But the South was trying to move over to a more industrialized farming, if you will, okay, rather than slavery, because slavery was too costly. Everybody made money on slaves. The northern people in the northern states, many of them had already used their right as a state to abolish slavery. And now they were denying the rights to the South. They wanted to deny the rights to the Southern people to do what they wanted to do, because there was no constitutional law that said that the federal government, that slavery was outlawed. It was a state issue. And the southern states just hadn't exercised their right to abolish slavery yet, like the northern states had. And Mr. Lincoln said, well, whether you want to do it or not, we're going to force you to do it. We're going to take away their rights, their states' rights. I don't know if I answered your question. Okay. There was a question in the back, and then I'll come back to you.
There's quite a few Southerners and organizations that have raised bronze statues of you and your beloved horse. And there's people up north that believe by raising your statue that would symbolize slavery and incite the Southerners to rise again. And some of them even want to take them down or put into museums, not in public place. How does that make you feel about taking your statue?
I didn't know that we had any statues. I mean, this is... I'm not looking for any statues or any monuments to what I did. I just did my duty. And if somebody puts them up, I'm not going to, that's up to them. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. But I would say that as society progresses, they tend to take the easy way out. And if you will teach me, then I'll listen to you, and whatever you say, I'll take for the gospel. They're not going to spend time learning on their own. And that's why we, as the generation who saw the elephant in battle, and those of you ladies who were so diligently working at home to keep the farms and the gas lights burning, it's up to us to make certain that the truths that I spoke of, that the fallacies that I addressed here, that you now maybe have some ammunition when somebody says something. You can say, that's not true. Question. And I'll come back to you in a minute. Question.
It's my understanding that the Emancipation Proclamation not merely, but only was addressing slavery in the South, and that there were slaves still in the North. Not every state had abolished slavery, but that it only dealt with slavery in the South. Is that not true?
That's true. That's true. And what's interesting is that Mr. Lincoln recognized that he didn't have the ability, the constitutional ability, to do that. And his cabinet members told him, you can't do that, that's not legal. But he did it anyway. And he did it because there was about 6 to 7% of the population who were true abolitionists at the time the war broke out. And if you get a bunch of people who are screaming and yelling and stomping on the ground and raising Cain and participating in mob rule, okay, they're going to get the attention of the elected officials. And the elected officials are going to say, what do we have to do? What can we do to calm this? What can we do to shut these people up? Well, maybe I ought to. I realized just 3 weeks ago I wrote a letter to Horace Greeley and said, I don't care if it's all slave, no slave, or part slave. Maybe I better, this thing I've been kind of agonizing over, maybe I better go ahead and sign it, and as soon as we have a victory, well, then along comes the Battle of Sharpsburg, And he uses that as a victory that allows him to say, well, okay, now we're gonna free the slaves. First off, the southern states had seceded legally. They had every right to do it. There's nothing in the Constitution that says they could not secede. Inherent by its absence, okay? If the government doesn't want us to do something, they'll pass a law saying you can't do it. There's nothing in the Constitution that says you cannot secede. Therefore, inherent by its absence, you can secede. And so, Mr. Lincoln decides that he's going to write a proclamation, and that will help the Negroes in the South. That'll encourage them to take up arms against their masters. Little did they know that a lot of the Negroes in the South were at home on the farms, and there were but about 5 or 6% of the population that owned slaves anyway. And those people were helping their ladies, their white ladies. I mean, they didn't have any reason to leave. They were being well treated. You might read some stories about some people being beaten, and you know, the factories up north, there's times when people will be injured in a factory and they just kick them out the door and say, we're done with you, you're over. We're not going to deal with you anymore. But in the South, you know, why would you beat a slave so we can't work? That doesn't make sense. So you're going to treat your slaves pretty well, and in most cases, most of the slaves, they didn't. This Emancipation Proclamation, fine, if you want to go ahead. I'm staying here with my lady. I'm staying here on the farm. Mr. Lincoln, the states had legally seceded. Mr. Lincoln had no jurisdiction over them, but the position that Mr. Lincoln took in his unwritten Constitution was that the states did not have the right to secede, even though 13 years before that he said they can do what they want to do. And every president, Buchanan back to Washington, every president at one time or another had acknowledged the fact that the states have the right to secede. But Mr. Lincoln said, I don't think so. And the reason he said that is because he recognized that if the southern states left, they took 80% of the money with them. Questions? Yes, sir. Yeah.
It's also true in saying you didn't believe that they had the right to secede.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Isn't it also true that in his saying that they did not have the right to secede, that he had the Maryland, I'm assuming was deciding to go with the South, their wealthy supply with the South?
The Maryland legislature.
Is it not true that Mr. Lincoln had those representatives, pro-Confederate ones, arrested without cause so they could not vote, and therefore the Capitol could not be surrounded pretty much from the onset?
The Maryland legislature wanted to meet, but they knew they couldn't meet in the Capitol because if they did, it was so close to Washington City that Mr. Lincoln would interfere. So they all got on a train and they were headed west, okay? And a general by the name of Butler came along and he stopped the train and arrested half of the Maryland legislature. Habeas corpus was suspended. He would take half of the legislature and put them in jail. And some of them stayed there for, I mean, they started releasing some of them late in October, November, and December of 1861. And some carried on over until they signed an oath of allegiance. You know, swearing that they would not take up arms, nor would they support anybody taking up arms. And that was carried well over into 1862. But yeah, he did that. He suspended habeas corpus and put him in jail. Yes, sir.
You cited 4 administrations that the session had that topic of. Was it always southern states that wanted to secede?
No, in 1803 through 05, the New England states threatened secession because President Jefferson had made the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. And now he's allocating dollars through Congress. He wants Congress to allocate dollars to explore that. And if they take that money to explore that, then that takes the money away from the states, New England states, that have been getting a large portion of from the federal treasury to build their infrastructure for their industrialization. The New England states said, you know, if you're going to take our money and send it out west, then we're just going to secede and form our own country. The same thing happened in 1812. They didn't want the war to go with the Second War with England to take place because they were trading with England. The New England states were trading with England, and they were getting a lot of good positive ideas on how to build their machinery to increase the production in the industrialized North. And so they said, well, now that you're at war with England, you know, we can't trade with them anymore, because if we trade with them, we will be called traitors, not traders, but traitors, okay, to the Constitution. So they talked about seceding, and then in 1830 to 32, you had the Jackson administration, and that came about because they had imposed some high tariffs on the people of the South, and South Carolina said, you know, this is unconstitutional, first off. The only way, according to the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 1 of the Constitution says that it says money will be raised through tariffs, duties, and imports, okay? And that was the only way that the federal government could raise money to pay the bills. Well, if you get some legislators, some zealous legislators, and they say, well, we're going to increase the tariffs on the people that import these particular products, then we'll raise money for the public treasury. Well, the people that imported those particular products were in the South. And so the South said, this is not fair, this is not equal, this is not an even tariff. So Jackson said, the people in South Carolina says, we have the right to withdraw, we're going to withdraw, and we're going to nullify these laws that are unconstitutional. And Jackson said, you have the right to secede if you want to, but if you do, I'm going to send federal troops down in and I'm going to force you back into the Union. Now, why would he do that? Well, because he didn't want to lose the money. And that's the same reason that Lincoln was using. I can't lose the money.